Welcome, everybody, to our second episode of Archaeology After Dark. My guest this week is Nicole Grinnan. Nicole, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and then we'll get started?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Nicole Grinnan. I currently work for the Florida Public Archaeology Network, which is a program of the University of West Florida. And what we do is not so much, research and archaeology as you traditionally think about it. Our job is to do outreach and education about local history and archaeology. So essentially to get the community engaged with their history and their heritage, to teach them what archaeologists are doing in the field and how we do what we do and what we've discovered over time. We also work with local governments to help them manage their historical and archaeological resources. A lot of local governments don't have archaeologists on staff or even historians, really. So they need outside organizations to give them a little bit of input on what they need to do to best manage their resources. And another thing we also do is we assist the state of Florida's Division of Historical Resources in promoting their programs about history and archaeology, and to kind of assist them with site monitoring or recording all different kinds of projects with the state as well. So we're kind of jacks of all trades here at the Florida Public Archaeology Network. And I got my education at the University of West Florida right here in Pensacola. I got my master's degree there in 2014 in historical archaeology. I do terrestrial or land-based archaeology, but my specialty really is underwater archaeology. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to come to the University of West Florida, because it has one of the only dedicated maritime archaeology programs in the United States, which is a pretty unique thing. And we have amazing archaeological sites right in our backyard in Pensacola Bay in the Gulf of Mexico. So it's a great place to do what we do. And beyond that, my original education was at the University of Central Florida, which is in Orlando. I got degrees there in history and anthropology, decided that I wanted to pursue anthropology or archaeology for a career. And that's kind of how I ended up here.
Thanks, Nicole. That's great. So, that leads us to today's topic. We're going to be talking about underwater archaeology. So, first things first, when you're talking about underwater archaeology, what is the first thing you want people to know about it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So underwater archaeology is essentially doing archaeology, the basic principles of archaeology. We're just doing it underwater. So we're using the same kinds of methods, the same kinds of way we do our research, but we're just using essentially different tools to do that underwater. So we use scuba and different excavation methods. One of the things about underwater archaeology is that it tends to have been romanticized over time. And one of the big culprits for this, and one of the people or organizations that I like to blame, is Disney. When we think about underwater archaeology, the first thing that people tend to think about are, Spanish galleons laden with gold and pirate ships, and just I think gold in general is really pervasive in underwater archaeology and treasure. And that's not to say that those things are wrong, right? There are underwater archaeological sites that we can associate with pirates. And there are underwater archaeological sites that were Spanish galleons carrying gold and valuable goods. Gold is just one component of that. Obviously, there's all different kinds of valuable goods like spices and cloth and textiles. But there are those kinds of ships that were sunk in Florida's waters. And I think the laser focus on those sites has kind of distorted what underwater archaeology is and what it actually means. So when we think about the history of ships and shipping around the world, I mean, it's only a very small fraction of those ships that were pirate ships or Spanish galleons with, treasure fleets. There's really so much more to human history. And as an underwater archaeologist, that's one of the major things I want to try and dispel to people, is that it's a lot cooler than just those couple of things. We can learn about people's lifeways, trade and commerce, navigation, the movement of people around the world. There's so much you can learn about people from ships and underwater archaeology. And I guess I'll just say I focus a lot on ships because that's been my experience in the past, but underwater archaeology is more than just that too. There are underwater archaeological sites that we can associate with some of the very first people in the Americas, right? The coastlines along in the Gulf Coast in Florida and Alabama used to be a lot further out during the Ice Age, right? Because most of our water was at the polar ice caps. And so one of the kind of pioneering fields of underwater archaeology is looking for archaeological sites that are now in the Gulf of Mexico. and land areas that would have been exposed during the Ice Age. So there's all different kinds of underwater archaeology, not just ships, but that has been most of my experience so far.
Do you have a project that you've worked on that you've enjoyed more than others, or that you were more passionate about, I guess?
Um,
I know
yeah,
it's kind of
that's a really good
unprofessional to
question.
say you'd like one project over another, but
Yeah, one of well, I guess kind of near and dear to my heart because it's kind of where I cut my teeth as a graduate student is an archaeological site that the University of West Florida has been working on since or a series of archaeological sites that the University of West Florida has been working on since 1992. And that's the Tristan da Luna shipwrecks that are here in Pensacola Bay. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Luna story, in 1559, the Spanish government, based out of Mexico, so New Spain, decided that they wanted to establish a settlement in what is now the United States. And really, the goal was to repel, the French that were imposing from the west, and then the English who were starting to impose from the north. And the idea was to make Florida a Spanish base so that they could protect their shipping, because a lot of the ships that were heading back to Spain from Central and South America had to go right next to Florida. And it was a good place where French or English privateers could attack Spanish ships. So in 1559, they decided to establish a settlement. They ended up choosing Pensacola Bay because it's a very deep water bay, unlike Mobile Bay, which is right next door. And so these ships, the shipwrecks that have been researched so far, there are 3 of them. One was first discovered in 1992 by Florida Division of Historical Resources, Bureau of Archaeological Research, their underwater team. And then subsequent shipwrecks were discovered in 2006 and then again in 2016, I believe. And so most of the graduate students who work or who kind of get their experience here at UWF work on those shipwreck sites. And it's a very unique thing to have. They're the second oldest ships that are recorded in the United States right now, the oldest being shipwrecks off of Padre Island in Texas. So we have a really unique resource right here. And I think because I spent so much time on those shipwrecks, they're probably one of my favorite places that I have worked. But I have worked some really incredible places too. So I guess I would have to choose that as a favorite if I needed to.
so those are ongoing projects that the university is still working on.
Yeah, that's correct. So for the last few years, we've primarily been working on the 2nd and 3rd shipwreck sites. The first one that was discovered in 1992, a lot of work has been done on that one. Although I think the estimate is that only about 40% of the actual ship has actually been excavated. But we've been working on the 2nd and the 3rd wreck, which we call Emmanuel Point 2 and Emmanuel Point 3 after a nearby landform. And so, yes, there's ongoing research on those. Of course, due to COVID-19, we have not been doing active work on those sites over this summer, which is unfortunate. They actually canceled the field schools for this year. But yes, there will be future work on those sites. The nice thing about them is they provide a lot of fodder for graduate master's theses. And so students who need to come up with a topic for their master's thesis on underwater archaeology often will find topics on those shipwreck sites.
Cool. This is more of a personal question. So you're going out onto the site, like I assume you have to take a boat from your launching location to where the actual site is. So you're all in your scuba equipment. I probably could have phrased that a little better, but you're flopping off the side of the boat to go down to the site. What goes through your mind when you're swimming down to it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It depends on the clarity of the water that day. If the water is really clear and beautiful, which there are those days, it's very peaceful and you're excited to get down on your site. And I guess also too, if it's a site you've been to frequently, you kind of know what to expect when you get down there. But I will say that one of the things that was most shocking to me when I first started doing underwater archaeology was doing what we call target diving. And so essentially what this is diving on potential sites based on survey data. So survey equipment, including magnetometer, which is essentially like an underwater metal detector, and then a side scan sonar, which can kind of give you an image of what's on the seafloor. And so we identify targets based on those survey methods, and then we go and dive them to confirm whether or not they are indeed a historical resources or not. And so you're essentially diving blind almost. And I think Alabama waters are pretty much the same way. They're very murky most of the
Oh
time.
yeah, it's like that through the entire state.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
entire state is murky.
Yeah.
Even when you're out of the water, it's still murky. All of it.
Yeah. And Pensacola is not much different. I mean, you go a little bit further east in Destin and those areas, it clears up a little bit more. They have beautiful water over there, but Pensacola is very, very much like Alabama. And, so you're diving, you're trying to find something that we saw on the computer, but you don't know where it is. So essentially what you do is you have your dive gear on, like you said, you roll over the side of the boat and you're descending in this murky water. You don't know how, you know how deep you're going to go, but you don't know really where the bottom is as you're going down. And if it's going to be squishy, like murky sand, or is it a hard bottom? You don't really know sometimes. And so then you start swimming in circles that are led, obviously, we try to be systematic in our survey. So we use a measuring tape and we swim out in circles that are increasingly bigger, right? So we'll start with 1 meter and 2 and 3 and 4 meters. And you can't see in the water. So essentially what you do is you're holding onto a tape, you're swimming. And what I would often do is put my hand in front of my face because I had these visions of just running headfirst into like, I don't know, a VW Beetle or a washing machine that somebody just dumped in Pensacola Bay. It sounds funny, but those things are out there. Or toilets.
That's why I'm
too.
laughing. I know that's true.
Yeah. And we can't tell what those things are usually from just the survey equipment. So again, it's up to the divers to go down there and be like, yep, it's another washing machine, or no, this is a 16th century shipwreck. So yeah, it's kind of intimidating sometimes.
So does the washing machine get included in the exhibit when you make one?
We like to joke about things that we find like that. And those, a lot of us who are divers in the program, we're also avid fishermen and spear fishermen. So even if it doesn't turn out to be an archaeological site, we'll often mark it on our charts and go back there and fish off of those sites later because sometimes there's good fish there.
So you swim at the site all day and then lunch is already there waiting for you.
And what's that? Say that again. I'm sorry.
And lunch is already there waiting on you when you get there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I assume you have to have a scuba certification to do underwater archaeology. Mm-hmm. What else is required if somebody wants to do this professionally? I mean, aside from the educational parts.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yeah, obviously, the federal government has set out guidelines for who's qualified to do archaeological work. And usually that entails having a master's degree and following a certain code of ethics, right? But to do underwater archaeology, yes, you really do have to be a scuba diver. The recommendation for most of our students coming into the program is to have at least your open water certification, which certifies you to dive to about 60 feet. It's kind of just the basic certification that most people get, before they go to the Caribbean and go on cruises or do something fun. But really, once you get to the point in your graduate student career that you're starting to lead and supervise projects, really you should have your advanced open water certification, which allows you to dive to 130 feet deep, which is the recreational limit. Beyond that, it's all what we call technical diving. And then also a rescue certification as well. So basically it teaches you how to identify problems with divers, right? To mitigate any issues that come up. Basically, it's almost like a CPR first aid course, but for divers, and teach you how to, rescue divers in the water. So really, that's what we encourage students who are very serious about doing this for their careers. Once they graduate, we encourage them to get those certifications as well. And they usually do, because, scuba diving is one of those things, if you are someone who really enjoys it, you want to learn more, right? You want to do more with it as you kind of progress and get more comfortable and more experience in the water. So it's pretty easy to tell those students who are really avid and are going to go somewhere with underwater archaeology, and those students are kind of just doing it because
it looks
maybe
good
they didn't know what they were getting into. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, you really do have to have a passion for being in the water in order to do underwater archaeology. But that being said, there are a lot of other career avenues for people who are maybe interested in underwater sites or maritime sites. Conservation, artifact conservation is another really important field. any artifact that comes out of the water has to be properly conserved before it can be displayed. Otherwise, you get things like, cannons and anchors that are rusting away and essentially turning into nothing over time, which you pretty frequently see. If you ever go to the Florida Keys, there's cannons and anchors lining the whole road down there. And they're just kind of rotting away because they've never been properly conserved. Same goes for artifacts, wood artifacts, organic materials like bone, ceramics, all kinds of different artifacts. They all need to be properly conserved. So that's another field that people who are really interested in underwater archaeology, but maybe don't have the passion or the desire to do the diving, they'll go into something like that. So there is always a need for those kinds of people as well.
So when you retrieve the artifacts from the ocean, does the conserving or conservation process start immediately, or do you have to get it back to shore before you can start the conservation process?
That's a really good question. The answer is we make sure that we are properly caring for these artifacts the second that they get out of the water. Salt water tends to be a little more problematic than fresh water. What we'll do in salt water or brackish water is we'll take the artifact, whatever it is, we'll put it in an artifact bag, but then we'll fill that bag with water from that body of water that we just collected it from. So that way it doesn't have the opportunity to dry out in between the time we've collected it and transporting it to the lab. Once we get it to the lab, the next key thing we have to do is get all of the salt out of that artifact, because salt can be very corrosive to, it doesn't really matter what kind of material, it can be corrosive to all materials. You see what salt air does to, cars and fences over time, just at our homes, So once we get it into the lab, what we'll usually start doing with all artifacts is rinsing out the salt. And usually what that means is baths of fresh water, distilled fresh water, trying to get all that salt out. And then once we have determined that all of the salt is out of that artifact, we've done enough freshwater baths over time, then, depending on what material the artifact is, it'll go into a certain type of conservation. So obviously conserving a piece of iron is very different than conserving a piece of wood. So they all have different processes. But yeah, so conservation starts the second we pull something out of the water. That's a really good question.
Okay, and you wanted to share some pictures of some projects that you worked on.
Yeah, I put together just maybe a little slideshow here of examples of what I do here at FPAN for outreach and education, but also some of the projects that I've been fortunate to partake in, including one just across the border in Dauphin Island. So let me go ahead and pull those up and I can share them with you and just kind of talk through them. Let me make my screen a little bigger here. All right. All right, Daniel, can you see the screen with the photo?
Yeah, it looks like a classroom.
Yes, so interesting observation. So I mentioned that what we do here at FPAN is outreach and education about archaeological resources, right? And one of the things we want to do is encourage people to engage with underwater resources because, they're places worth visiting and learning about. And the idea is, if we provide people with the opportunity to engage with these resources, that they'll be more willing to advocate for their protection and preservation in the long term. So a couple of summers ago, we came up with a new program called Public Archaeological Shipwreck Tours, or PASS. And we actually brought groups of divers out to those Emmanuel Point shipwrecks that I mentioned earlier, the ones from 1559. Now, they're not great diving, so they're not places that people would normally go visit. And they're also active archaeological sites. A lot of people ask me, is it legal for us to go out to these sites by ourselves? And the answer is yes, it is, but it would be illegal for you to disturb the bottom and remove artifacts. So what we wanted to do was get people out there. And a lot of these people are individuals who are engaged with the local diving community, the part of a local dive club. And we thought this would be a good place to start with that basic education about underwater archaeology. So yeah, this first image is us in the classroom. And before we go out and dive, we want to give them some background information on what they're going to go see in the hopes that they appreciate it a little more when they go out there. So we talked about the history of the Luna expedition to Pensacola, why they chose Pensacola as a place to settle. And so what you see here are a group of divers in the classroom learning about the history. Another program that we often do is called the Submerged Sites Education and Archaeological Stewardship Program. And the goal of this program is to teach just basic recreational divers methods of mapping and recording shipwreck sites so that they can then go out and help monitor and record changes over time on some of Florida's underwater archaeological preserve sites. And these are 12 shipwrecks around the state of Florida that have been designated as essentially museums in the sea. And so what you see here are a group of our divers learning, as you see our pool noodle shipwreck right there, but essentially learning the basic parts and pieces, yeah, of a shipwreck.
Must have lost so many people on that shipwreck.
I know, yeah. The great noodle wreck of 1805. But essentially teaching them how an archaeologist would go about mapping and recording that site. And then, of course, learning kind of what the parts and pieces are and what to look for when you're in the water. And so all of our programs have that classroom portion and then just that ability to talk with people or interface with them on land. And then a lot of what we'll do is also some training in the pool, especially for that submerged sites education course. So what you're seeing here are a group of divers in a pool, and they are mapping and recording sites underwater. Because it's one thing to do it on land when you can talk to your dive buddy, right? But doing it underwater and being forced to use just hand signals as communication is very different. And not only that, you're having to manage your scuba gear, right? Your buoyancy. You're having to manage a measuring tape, and you're also having to manage a slate with a pencil on it. And it doesn't sound like a lot, but those of you who have dove or maybe divers know that this is a lot of stuff to manage underwater, because often just making sure that you're not crashing to the bottom or floating up to the top is that's a work in itself. So it does take a lot of practice.
So the hand signals that you mentioned are those universal, like across the United States, or they differ from place to place?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes. So the scuba diver training agencies adhere to universal diver training standards. And so essentially all of the hand signals are the same, but there are variations from place to place. And in different languages, they are different as well. So I would say in the United States, for the most part, they're all the same. You know, thumbs up means let's go up. Thumbs down means let's go down. This is the okay sign, which means everything's okay. But numbers tend to be where things get different depending on where you learned. As underwater archaeologists, we like to use what the Navy divers use for saying numbers underwater. And basically you can do it all with one hand. It's very easy. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is vertical. And then 6, 7, 8, 9 is horizontal. And 0 is, of course, just 0. And a decimal point, we just kind of punch. So if you have a measurement that's like 2.9, you would say 2.9. So that's the way we teach it. And that's kind of the standard with the Navy divers. So that's what we've kind of stuck with. That's a good question. So once we've done, our on land training and our confined water training in the pool, we'll often then go out to known shipwreck sites to get some practice. And in this particular class, we partnered with Biscayne National Park, which is down in Southeast Florida, just south of Miami in the Homestead area. And this is on a shipwreck called the Earl King, which is a part of their Maritime Heritage Trail. So it's a known shipwreck site. It's been interpreted before, it's been recorded before, but it's a great place to practice. And as you can see, the visibility there is very lovely. So we often do these programs in the Keys because it's a lot easier for people to manage in good visibility water. As you get more advanced, then you could probably move on to the murkier waters of the Northern Gulf.
So what amount of time does this program go over? I assume it takes more than a day to get all this done.
Yeah, this particular program we usually do over the course of 3 days. So we'll do 1 day of classroom learning, 1 day, usually it's a half day of being in the pool, and then we'll do 1 day of open water diving. So diving out in the ocean on these shipwreck sites. So it's a 3-day training for people. So, it's a big time commitment, but again, I mentioned before, people who are avid divers, they are avid divers. And when they want to learn to do something new, they're pretty dedicated to it. So the people who are taking this course are people who are very interested and kind of don't mind taking those 3 days to do something, learn something new. And this is just another photo of some of our divers on the Shipwreck site. And you can see they've got their measuring tape. They've got their little slate where they're recording the Shipwreck site. So yeah, they're doing a great job here. And then these are just more pictures from that particular class that we did. This is really nice diving. And I will say that most of the actual underwater archaeology that I've done does not take place in water like this. This is pretty ideal. And of course, again, this is in South Florida. This is not in the northern Gulf Coast. And then here's a group shot. So you can see there's me back there. Who else do we got? We have Della Scott Ireton, who's our associate director here at the Florida Public Archaeology Network. She's also an underwater archaeologist. And of course, you see lots of other folks who are participants in this particular class. A couple of years ago, I had the really unique opportunity to work on an underwater archaeological site that is kind of what I was talking about before. It was an indigenous American site that predated our current temperature. So basically what I'm saying is it was kind of an ice age era site. And so over time, as water levels rose, right, the site became inundated. And what we're working on at this particular site, it's down in South Central Florida in the Gulf of Mexico. It was what we call a mortuary pond. So it was a pond when the area around it was dry land, and this is where people were burying their dead. And over time, as sea levels rose after the end of the ice age, the pond and the area around it was inundated. The really amazing thing is because it was a pond, there was a lot of kind of like peaty mud, right? Which is gross, but amazing for preservation over time. And that's how this site was preserved and was in such amazing condition. We were able to go do that work. This was a project that was led by the Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research. They often ask FPAN for help on projects like these when they just need people to be out there and to assist with diving and collecting data. So this was one of my favorite projects that I got to work on with them. And so that's me taking some measurements underwater. They had this really cool system rigged up where, as we excavate in the water, we are very careful about how deep we're going because we need to record essentially almost every centimeter as we go. And so we will often measure how deep we're going. So here's the measuring stick here, and then they've got this really neat underwater laser hooked up. So it gives me a pretty accurate measurement. Here at the university, we often use just string in a line level, but they have this really cool laser system lined up. So that was kind of fun. Here's another really neat site that I got to work on as a graduate student. This is actually in New Hampshire. And this is a shipwreck called the Lady of the Lake. It was a transport vessel that worked on Lake Winnipesaukee, which is, if you're familiar with New England, it's a really popular summer location for people to go to get away from the cities. And the shipwreck, essentially, it's a large steamer, right, that's just sitting right on the bottom of this lake. And so the water is cool and it's fresh water. So there was very excellent preservation on the site. And so this is the very bow of the shipwreck. And that's me taking some measurements off the bow there. So it's a really neat site to work on.
So you said this one was a steamer. So that means this wreck is post-industrial revolution? Is that right?
It is, yes. So it was working on the lake, I believe, around 1890 to 1910, although I'd probably have to look that up. It's been a long time since I worked on this project. But yeah, I mean, I guess it was very reliable. I can see it. Let me look that up right quick because now I'm curious too. Yeah, it was a really exciting project. It was actually the thesis project for one of the graduate students here at the university. And she was looking for volunteers to go up and do recording on the site. And not a lot of people volunteered because it's very cold. And also we had to camp and do the diving, which meant that none of our gear really dried out each day. So not only was it cold outside and the water was cold, but Our gear was also cold.
It was just cold in general.
Yeah. I mean, it was a really unique opportunity, so I don't regret it at all. So looking at divewinnipesaukee.com, which is one of the dive shops that we worked with, the Lady of the Lake was built in 1848 to 1849, and she worked on Lake Winnipesaukee until about 1872. So yeah, right around that industrial period. She was a side wheel paddle steamer. Really cool shipwreck. And then in January of this year, before everything stopped, I did get a call from the Alabama Historical Commission to go out and look at a shipwreck site that had been washed out during, I guess it was a recent storm that had just moved sand around on Dauphin Island. And they just wanted essentially an underwater archaeologist to go out to the site and record it and produce a little report for them, just so that they had updated information about the site. I don't believe that AHC has an underwater archaeologist on staff, so they'll often get in touch with us when they have little projects like these. And so my colleague Mike Toman and I went out there and we met up with a group of volunteers that were led by Bonnie Gums, who works at the University of South Alabama. She's wonderful. And we recorded the site. Mike, my colleague, I took the measurements and took some photos of this shipwreck itself. It's a little hard to see here, but you can kind of see the outline of the hull of the ship. It's got a very kind of squared off transom at the back here. And then this is the bow towards the water. My colleague Mike did some really cool drone footage of the site as well for the Historical Commission.
And for those of you who aren't familiar with what the water normally looks like in Alabama, that gives you a really good idea of what we mean when we say murky.
Yeah, actually, and this is actually probably a pretty nice day because again, it was in January. So it was before, a lot of the algae blooms start up. But yes, this is pretty typical of Pensacola as well. So yes, diving in our area, it takes a little getting used to. We made the determination that the vessel was probably an old oystering boat. So kind of like the one in this image here, and this image I got from Alabama Archives. This is picture taken in 1938, but you can almost see it. It's a relatively small vessel, so you can, just me standing in it, you can see it's fairly small because the bow is right off the edge of the picture here. And it's got that really nice squared off transom, pretty basic construction, ending in kind of this pointed bow here. So we're pretty sure based on what we saw out there that that's the kind of vessel we were looking at, which, it's not a big glamorous shipwreck or anything, but it speaks to local heritage and the importance of industries like oystering during this time period. So all of the sites, whether or not they're big, sexy shipwrecks, they all have kind of importance to our communities. So it's telling a cool story. And then this, I think, is the last photo that I put in here, and it's a little hazy, so you might just kind of have to look around at the image real quick to see what I'm showing you. But I had the opportunity a few years ago to go dive in the Great Lakes, and in particular in Lake Michigan. And if you aren't familiar with the Great Lakes and the diving in the Great Lakes, it's kind of one of the meccas for people who like shipwreck diving, because when ships sank in the Great Lakes over time, for whatever reason, usually storms pick up pretty quickly on the Great Lakes. Those shipwrecks are sinking in very cold water that and the water doesn't have a lot of life in it. And so those shipwrecks, for the most part, stay preserved very well underwater. Not like Florida and not like Alabama. It's very different here, right? Shipwrecks degrade pretty quickly over time. We have very dynamic coastlines, but that's not so in the Great Lakes. And so this was a shipwreck. This was actually a schooner, a fairly large schooner that we dove, called the Grecian. And this was part of a conference that we were attending in the area. Actually, we had the opportunity to go diving. And what you're seeing is actually the back deck or the stern of the shipwreck looking out. And so you can see that the railing around the back deck is still there, right? And you can see some of the machinery is still there in place, and that the deck of the ship is still perfectly intact. And so for me, this was kind of a dream to be able to go up to the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary and dive on shipwrecks like this for a few days. So yes, those experiences. We don't see a lot of things like this in our area. So as an underwater archaeologist, it was pretty. And I think that's all the photos I had. Happy to answer any questions about them if you had more, or yeah.
I know you said it was a lot colder up in the Great Lakes. Does the temperature of the water really make that much difference in preservation?
It does, yeah, and mostly that's tied to marine life, um, and also the fact that the Great Lakes are freshwater too, right? So we don't have that issue of salt corrosion over time like we do in, the Gulf of Mexico or in our oceans. But the cold water, really doesn't allow for certain kinds of life to form. One thing I'm thinking about in particular are ship boring worms or teredo worms. And we have those in our warm waters here in the Gulf of Mexico. And essentially they're bivalves, actually. They're not technically worms, but they eat away at wood over time. And that affects a lot of especially our wooden shipwreck sites. So they degrade very quickly and they get eaten away. And that's often why a lot of times, especially on very old shipwreck sites, the only real wood timbers that you're going to find on these sites are the ones that are buried in the sand that are out of the way of fish and wood boring animals. The Manual Point shipwreck sites that we have here in Pensacola Bay, the 1559 ones, they were covered up in sediment outflow from our rivers over time. And so anything that's kind of above that level of the sediment is gone, except for the ballast stones that were weighing down the ship, right? Nothing really eats rocks. But the only timbers that we've found from those wreck sites are the ones that are buried in that sediment. So yeah, really the big problem are those wood boring organisms and other organisms that eat wood over time. So yes, the cold water makes a huge difference in what kind of life you've got and what kind of preservation there is.
Speaking of life, I'm sure people are probably wondering, sharks.
Yeah.
So how big of a problem can they be? I mean, I know they get very big, making them a big problem, but
Yeah.
how big of a problem exactly?
That's a really good question. And I get this question from underwater archaeology students. I get it from groups that I talk to, and then also my scuba diving students too. They all want to know about sharks. And what I'll say is that sharks are typically more scared of us than we should be of them. When we're scuba diving, just say we're doing a recreational dive for fun, right? Not even doing underwater archaeology. We're creating a lot of noise when we're scuba diving, right? The way that we're breathing in and out, the bubbles that are coming out of our regulator, that's a lot of noise underwater. And sharks tend not to be attracted to that. They don't want to be around that. When we're doing underwater archaeology and say we're doing something like dredging, which is how we excavate, it's essentially like a big underwater vacuum. The noise of that dredging underwater, it's very loud and really blocks out almost everything else. You can't hear too much when you're dredging underwater. And the sharks don't like that either. So I've never had an encounter with a shark when I've just been casually scuba diving or doing underwater archaeology. What I will say is sharks are attracted to things like dead fish. So the only times I've really had an encounter with shark are when I've been spearfishing, right? So you're spearfishing, obviously a little bit of blood gets in the water, and sharks have learned the sound of spear guns in some cases, especially in this area where it's so popular. And they'll often come and check it out and see if they can't get a snack, because a lot of times, the sharks will hear the spear gun, they'll come over, and then divers will get frightened. And so they'll just throw the fish or whatever at the shark. And, that teaches the shark over time, like, oh, if I go over to hear this sound, then I'm going to get a free meal. And really, that's kind of a problem. It's a learned behavior that divers have taught them over time. So trying to teach people not to do that when a shark comes nearby. But, there's only so much you can do. People are inherently afraid of sharks, and I get it. They're big and they have giant teeth and they're very strong animals. You can tell just looking at their muscles in the water. But I will say, just having a fun dive and doing underwater archaeology, I've never had a problem with sharks.
So is there anything else you'd like to tell us about underwater archaeology or what you do in general?
We covered a lot, which is really cool. One of the things I just want people to keep in mind is that underwater archaeological sites, they're kind of out of sight, out of mind for most people. And so a lot of people think that these places aren't protected, but that's not necessarily true. They are protected by laws. state laws and federal laws. And, what we encourage people to do is treat these sites like they're state parks or national parks, right? We tell people to take only photos and leave only bubbles, right? You want to leave no trace when you visit these places. And there's a few reasons for that. Obviously, as archaeologists, we're very interested in these sites for the stories that they can tell us about the human past, right? We're biased in that way. But shipwreck sites also, especially in waters in the Gulf of Mexico, in our rivers and our lakes around here, they act as essentially underwater artificial reefs, right? They're ecosystems unto themselves. They're homes to thousands of animals. And so we don't want to disturb these sites because we're essentially disturbing the homes of these creatures living underwater. And then, of course, shipwreck sites and other underwater archaeological sites are places that people want to go and visit. People inherently want to go see shipwreck sites. And we have a lot of really amazing ones in our area in the Gulf of Mexico. And so it behooves us to protect and preserve these sites because they are serving our local economies, right? Whether it's charter boats, dive shops, restaurants, hotels, it kind of snowballs outward when you think about it. So there are a lot of reasons to care about underwater archaeological sites, to advocate for them when they need advocating for, and to protect and preserve them in the long run. So usually that's what I try to impress upon people when I talk about underwater archaeology.
So say somebody like an undergraduate student, they have a sudden interest in underwater archaeology. Maybe they want to pursue it a little more. Mm-hmm. What books or websites would you recommend they look at to help sink their teeth into?
That's a really good question. One of the first things I would recommend if you think you want to do underwater archaeology is to go get your initial scuba certification. Go get that open water certification and see if you like being in the water. That will be, I think, one of the first ways that you should kind of dip your toes, as it were, into underwater archaeology. But other than that, as far as books go, and I'm looking at my bookshelf right now because there's a lot of really good ones. One of the reasons I got into it was because I loved maritime culture. I've always lived near the ocean. And so for me, that was kind of my way into it. It was something I've always been interested in. And I really liked scuba diving.
Yeah, I wrote a paper on privateering in the American Revolution for one of my last undergrad projects. Yeah. And I had a great time doing it. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Books, there are a ton of books I could recommend, and some are more technical than others and may or may not be interesting to just a casual reader, but there's plenty of good information online. And, I wish I could provide more information about Alabama programs because I know you all are in Alabama. But if you're interested in underwater archaeology, the state of Florida really does have some good sites, and they've been involved in education projects for a long time. There's the Florida Panhandle Shipwreck Trail website, which provides archaeological information about these sites, history about the sites on this trail, as well as information about the biology, videos, photographs, you name it. That might be a good way to kind of see if this is something that you might be interested in producing into the future, right, as an underwater archaeologist. There's also museumsinthesea.com, which is another program of the state of Florida. It's another shipwreck trail.
I've seen that one. I've seen that one. It's actually really good. I enjoy looking at it, not physically, but internetally.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, there's lots and lots of books. I mean, you could just do a cursory Google search and find something on a topic that interests you. But these websites are, I think, a good way to get an idea about what underwater archaeologists are actually trying to produce with our work. Like I said, we're learning, it's not just the stuff, the ships and the artifacts, it's the histories that we're really trying to get at. So that might be a good way to kind of see if that's what you want to do.
Well, I think that'll wrap it up unless you have anything else you want to add onto it.
No, thank you for inviting me today. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, this was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. And I also learned a lot.
Good. That's always my hope.
All right. Thanks, Nicole.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel.